The silence between them had become so thick you could slice it with a butter knife. James Blakeson sat across from his wife of 14 years at their granite kitchen island, both pretending to read their phones while picking at takeout Chinese food neither of them really wanted. The overhead lights cast harsh shadows across their faces, making them look like strangers who happened to share the same address. He watched her scroll through social media with the mechanical precision of someone desperately avoiding eye contact, her wedding ring catching the light every few seconds like a tiny accusation. When she finally looked up and said the words that would change everything, her voice was so calm it felt like a business transaction. "James, I don't feel attracted to you anymore." He set down his chopsticks, not because he was shocked, but because he'd been waiting 3 years for someone to finally say it out loud. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. James had always prided himself on being the kind of husband who noticed things. He noticed when Margaret changed her shampoo, when she rearranged the living room furniture by 2 inches, when she started wearing that new perfume that smelled like expensive department stores instead of the vanilla body spray she'd used since college. What he hadn't noticed, or maybe what he'd refused to acknowledge, was the exact moment when looking at her stopped making his pulse quicken and started feeling like staring at a beautiful painting in a museum. Something you could appreciate from a distance but had no desire to touch. The realization hadn't hit him like a lightning bolt. It had crept in slowly, like water damage behind a wall that you don't discover until the whole structure is already compromised. First, it was the way he stopped reaching for her hand during movies. Then how he began staying late at the office, not because he had extra work, but because the thought of coming home to make small talk about her day at the yoga studio felt exhausting. By the time he started volunteering for weekend business trips to cities he had no particular interest in visiting, he knew they were both living in a house that had become more like a high-end boarding facility for 2 polite strangers. Margaret worked part-time as a wellness coach, which meant she spent most of her day telling other people how to optimize their lives, while their own marriage slowly dissolved in the background like sugar and rain. She had the kind of effortless beauty that made other men turn their heads in grocery stores. Long auburn hair that always fell perfectly even when she claimed she hadn't brushed it, green eyes that photographs never quite captured correctly, and the lean build of someone who did Pilates religiously and posted inspirational quotes about self-care on Instagram. James used to feel proud walking into restaurants with her, used to enjoy the split second of envy he'd catch in other men's eyes. Now he felt like he was escorting a celebrity he'd never actually met. Their house in Riverside Heights was everything they'd dreamed of when they were 26 and drunk on the possibility of forever. 4 bedrooms they'd never filled with children, a master bathroom with a soaking tub Margaret used twice, and a backyard pool that mostly served as an expensive reflection pond. James made good money as a senior project manager for a construction company that specialized in commercial buildings, shopping centers, office complexes, the kind of structures that would outlast most marriages. The irony wasn't lost on him that he could oversee the construction of buildings designed to stand for 50 years, while his own foundation crumbled beneath his feet. They'd met at a friend's wedding, one of those magical nights where everything aligned perfectly and the open bar made everyone more charming than they actually were. Margaret had been wearing a blue dress that made her look like she'd stepped out of a 1940s movie. And when she laughed at his joke about the wedding cake looking like a small building he'd recently constructed, he knew he was going to marry her. The courtship had been textbook romantic. Dinner dates where they talked until the restaurant staff started stacking chairs. Weekend trips to bed and breakfasts where they stayed in bed until checkout time. Long phone calls that stretched past midnight because neither wanted to be the first to hang up. The wedding was perfect. Margaret had planned every detail with the precision of a military operation, from the seasonal flowers that matched her grandmother's vintage brooch to the playlist that seamlessly transitioned from ceremony to cocktail hour to dancing. James had stood at the altar watching her walk down the aisle and felt like the luckiest man alive. In the photos from that day, their faces are radiant with the kind of joy that seems impossible to fake. He still had those photos in his phone, but looking at them now felt like examining archaeological evidence from a civilization that no longer existed. The first few years had been everything the marriage books promised. They finished each other's sentences, shared inside jokes that made them laugh until their stomachs hurt, and had the kind of physical chemistry that made them late to social events because they couldn't keep their hands off each other. Margaret would leave little notes in his lunchbox, and he'd surprise her with flowers on random Tuesdays just because he'd driven past the florist and thought of her smile. They talked about having kids someday, bought a house with good schools in mind, and spent lazy Sunday mornings reading different sections of the newspaper while their feet touched under the covers. But somewhere around year 7, the conversation started getting thinner. The silences between words grew longer. The inside jokes stopped being funny, and the physical chemistry began feeling more like muscle memory than genuine desire. They still had sex, but it became scheduled around her ovulation cycle when they were trying to get pregnant, and later scheduled around nothing at all except the vague sense that married couples were supposed to be intimate on some regular basis. James found himself thinking about work during foreplay and wondering if she was doing the same thing. Margaret started spending more time at the gym, then more time with friends from the gym, then more time anywhere that wasn't their house. She signed up for book clubs and wine tastings and weekend retreats focused on finding your authentic self. James threw himself into work with the dedication of a monk, accepting every overtime opportunity and volunteering to oversee projects in different states just to have something to talk about at dinner besides the weather and what they'd watched on Netflix the night before. The fighting, when it finally started, was almost a relief. At least anger was an emotion they both still felt. Margaret accused him of being emotionally unavailable, of caring more about concrete and steel than his own wife. James accused her of being self-absorbed, of turning their marriage into another wellness project she could optimize and abandon when it didn't give her the results she wanted. They had loud arguments about small things: whose turn it was to unload the dishwasher, whether they needed to replace the living room rug, why he never wanted to go to her friends' dinner parties anymore. But underneath all those surface disputes was the thing neither of them wanted to say out loud. They simply didn't want each other anymore. Not physically, not emotionally, not in any of the ways that make a marriage feel like more than just an expensive roommate situation with shared credit cards and a joint checking account. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. James started working later and later, not because his job demanded it, but because sitting in his office reviewing blueprints felt more comfortable than sitting on his couch next to a woman who used to make his heart race and now made him feel like he was suffocating. Margaret began booking more weekend workshops and girls' trips, always with perfectly reasonable explanations about personal growth and maintaining friendships, but they both knew she was just practicing being away from him. The sex stopped gradually, the way seasons change, so slowly you don't notice until you're shivering and realize you've been wearing the wrong clothes for months. First, it was just when one of them was too tired or stressed. Then it became easier to go to bed at different times, to avoid the awkward moment of lying next to each other and pretending not to notice that neither was making a move. Eventually, they stopped pretending altogether. Margaret moved her skincare routine to the guest bathroom and started going to bed earlier. James began staying up late watching documentaries about engineering marvels and falling asleep on the couch more often than not. Their friends started noticing. Dinner parties became exercises in performing happiness, with both of them playing their roles as the successful, attractive couple while secretly counting the minutes until they could go home and return to their separate corners. Other couples would tell jokes about married sex or complain about their spouses in that affectionate way that long-term partners do, and James and Margaret would smile and nod while feeling like anthropologists studying a culture they no longer belonged to. The worst part wasn't the lack of passion, it was the complete absence of curiosity about each other. James realized he could spend an entire evening with Margaret and learn nothing new about her thoughts, her dreams, her fears, or her plans. She had become as familiar and unremarkable as the kitchen appliances, something he interacted with daily but never really saw anymore. And he suspected, with a clarity that made his chest tight, that she felt exactly the same way about him. They both started having separate social lives. Margaret joined a hiking group that took weekend trips to national parks, always returning with photos of herself looking windblown and free in ways she never looked at home. James started playing poker with guys from work every Thursday night, not because he particularly enjoyed gambling, but because it was 4 hours where he could be around people who didn't know him as half of a failing marriage. The house began to feel like a museum of their former happiness. The wedding photos on the mantelpiece started looking like evidence from someone else's life. The expensive furniture they'd picked out together during their first year of marriage, the sectional sofa where they used to watch movies curled up together, the dining room table where they'd hosted dinner parties for friends who now invited them separately, became monuments to intimacy they could barely remember experiencing. James found himself staying at the office until 8 or 9 most nights, then stopping at the gym on the way home, then sometimes grabbing dinner by himself at the sports bar near their house. By the time he walked through the front door, Margaret would usually be in bed reading or in the guest room doing yoga with an online instructor. They'd exchange pleasantries about their days with the politeness of cordial neighbors, then retreat to their separate activities until it was time to sleep in the same bed while carefully avoiding any accidental contact. The loneliness was suffocating. James had never understood how you could feel completely alone while living with another person until he was experiencing it every single day. He would lie awake listening to Margaret breathe beside him and feel like he was sharing a bed with a stranger who happened to know his social security number and his coffee order. Sometimes he would study her sleeping face in the dim light filtering through their curtains and try to remember what it felt like to want to kiss her, to touch her hair, to whisper something intimate in her ear. The memories were there, but they felt like scenes from a movie he'd watched a long time ago starring actors who looked vaguely familiar. Margaret seemed to be going through her own version of the same experience. She became increasingly focused on personal improvement projects, meditation retreats, online courses about discovering your life purpose, books about conscious uncoupling that she left strategically placed on the coffee table. She started talking about wanting to travel more, to explore different cultures, to find herself outside the confines of suburban married life. When she talked about these dreams, her eyes would light up in ways they never did when she talked about their weekend plans or their anniversary coming up. The breaking point had been building for months before it finally arrived. They'd been invited to James's coworker's anniversary party, one of those milestone celebrations where couples who'd been married for 25 years renewed their vows and gave speeches about how they fell more in love with each other every year. James and Margaret had sat at their assigned table, making polite conversation with other couples who seemed genuinely happy to be there together, watching the anniversary couple dance to their wedding song with tears in their eyes, surrounded by children and grandchildren who looked at them like they were relationship goals incarnate. On the drive home, the silence in the car had been so complete that James could hear his own heartbeat. Margaret stared out the passenger window at the suburban landscape passing by, her hands folded in her lap like she was praying or trying to solve a complex mathematical problem. When they pulled into their driveway, neither of them moved to get out of the car immediately. They sat there in the darkness of their garage, the engine ticking as it cooled down, both of them knowing that something needed to be said, but neither wanting to be the one to say it. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, they'd been moving around each other like polite ghosts, having conversations about mortgage payments and whose turn it was to call the landscaping company, while the real conversation waited in the background like a storm system moving slowly toward shore. James had started rehearsing different versions of the speech in his head, how he would bring up their lack of connection, how he would suggest counseling, how he would try to salvage something from the wreckage of what had once been the most important relationship in his life. But when Margaret looked up from her phone that Tuesday night and said the words he'd been both dreading and anticipating, he realized that she'd been having the same internal conversations, the same middle-of-the-night realizations, the same gradual acknowledgement that they were both living a lie that had become too expensive to maintain. "I don't feel attracted to you anymore," she said, her voice steady and clear like she was reading from a script she'd been practicing. The words hung in the air between them, finally giving shape to the thing that had been slowly consuming their marriage from the inside out, like termites in the walls of a house that still looked beautiful from the street. James set down his chopsticks and looked at his wife, really looked at her for the first time in months. She was still beautiful in the objective way that beautiful women are, but looking at her felt like looking at an expensive piece of art in a gallery. He could appreciate the craftsmanship, admire the composition, even understand why other people might want to possess it. But he felt no desire to take it home with him, no urge to make it part of his daily life, no emotional connection that went beyond polite aesthetic appreciation. "The feeling is mutual," he said, and the relief in his voice surprised them both. For the first time in years, they were having an honest conversation about their marriage. And for the first time in years, they were both telling the truth about what they actually wanted, which turned out to be the same thing: a way out of the beautiful, expensive, suffocating life they'd built together and no longer knew how to live in. The conversation that followed was unlike any they'd had since the early days of their relationship, when they could talk for hours about everything and nothing. Except this time, instead of building something together, they were carefully dismantling it, piece by piece, with the precision of demolition experts who understood that some structures were too damaged to be repaired and too dangerous to leave standing. Margaret admitted that she'd been feeling like a stranger in her own life for almost 2 years. She talked about waking up every morning and having to remember how to play the role of James's wife, how exhausting it had become to pretend that their quiet dinners were comfortable instead of suffocating, how guilty she felt for not wanting the life that looked so perfect from the outside. She confessed that she'd been researching apartments online, not because she was planning to leave, but because imagining herself living somewhere else was the only thing that made her feel like she could breathe normally. James found himself sharing things he'd never said out loud, not even to himself during those long nights lying awake next to her. He talked about how he'd started taking on extra projects, not just to avoid coming home, but because work was the only place where he still felt like himself, competent, engaged, passionate about something. He admitted that he'd been having dreams about being single again, not sexual dreams about other women, but dreams about coming home to an empty apartment where he could eat cereal for dinner and watch whatever he wanted on television without having to negotiate with someone whose preferences had become as foreign to him as if she spoke a different language. They talked until almost midnight, sitting across from each other at the kitchen island where they'd shared thousands of meals, dissecting their marriage with the clinical detachment of scientists examining a specimen under a microscope. There was no yelling, no accusations, no dramatic gestures, just two people who had once loved each other very much, acknowledging that love, apparently, could die as quietly and gradually as it had once been born, not in a moment of betrayal or crisis, but in the slow accumulation of ordinary days when they stopped seeing each other as individuals and started seeing each other as obstacles to the lives they actually wanted to be living. The strangest part was how relieved they both felt. For years, they'd been carrying the weight of a marriage that neither of them wanted to be in, feeling guilty for not feeling grateful for a life that looked enviable to everyone else. Finally admitting the truth felt like setting down suitcases they'd been carrying for so long they'd forgotten how much lighter they could feel without them. By the time they went to bed that night, still in the same bed, but for the last time as a married couple in denial about their own feelings, they had already begun making plans. Not detailed plans, not yet, but the rough outline of how two people who had once promised to love each other forever could separate their lives with dignity, honesty, and as much kindness as possible under the circumstances. James fell asleep that night feeling something he hadn't experienced in years: curiosity about his own future. For the first time since he could remember, tomorrow felt like the beginning of something rather than just another day to be endured in a life that no longer fit him properly. And in the bed next to him, Margaret was lying awake with the same feeling, staring at the ceiling and imagining all the ways her life could expand once she stopped trying to squeeze it into the shape of a marriage that had been slowly suffocating them both. The divorce attorney's office smelled like leather-bound books and expensive disappointment. James sat in a chair that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, watching Margaret sign papers with the same focused concentration she'd once used to plan their wedding. Her signature had changed over the years, become more angular, more decisive, like she'd been practicing for this exact moment without realizing it. The lawyer, a soft-spoken woman in her 50s who specialized in what she diplomatically called conscious uncoupling, explained each document with the patience of someone who had guided hundreds of couples through this particular form of surgery. Unlike the contentious divorces that filled television dramas, theirs was proceeding with an almost eerie civility. They'd agreed to mediation instead of litigation, splitting their assets with the mechanical precision of accountants dividing a business partnership. Margaret would keep the house. She'd always loved it more than he had, and her wellness coaching business was slowly building a client base in their neighborhood. James would take his 401k, his truck, and his grandfather's tools, along with enough furniture to set up a decent apartment somewhere closer to his office. They divided their wedding gifts like they were splitting up a deceased relative's estate, each taking the items that held the most practical value rather than sentimental meaning. The strangest part was how efficiently they could dismantle a life they'd spent 14 years building. Joint credit cards were canceled and reissued individually, bank accounts were separated, insurance policies were modified. Margaret found a new dentist and updated her emergency contact information at work. James changed his address with the post office and started forwarding his mail to a furnished apartment in downtown Millfield that he'd rented sight unseen because it was available immediately and had a month-to-month lease. Their friends didn't know how to react. The couples they'd socialized with for over a decade suddenly found themselves in an awkward position. How do you maintain relationships with both halves of a divorced couple who aren't angry at each other? Sarah and Tom Jenkins, who'd been their closest friends since their newlywed days, kept trying to arrange group dinners where they could all hang out just like old times. But sitting around the same restaurant table where they'd celebrated birthdays and anniversaries, making polite conversation about work and weather while carefully avoiding any mention of their personal lives, felt like performing in a play where everyone had forgotten their lines. James's coworkers were equally confused by his calm demeanor. They'd seen plenty of guys go through messy divorces, the type that involved angry phone calls during lunch breaks, emergency meetings with lawyers, and bitter custody battles over pets and plasma televisions. But James showed up to work every day at the same time, completed his projects with his usual attention to detail, and never once complained about alimony payments or having to find a new place to live. When his boss asked if he needed to take some personal time to deal with everything, James genuinely didn't know what there was to deal with. He and Margaret had already handled the practical aspects of their separation with the efficiency of a well-run business closing down an underperforming branch. The apartment James rented was everything their house wasn't: small, impersonal, and utterly free of memories. It came furnished with generic furniture that looked like it had been selected by someone whose only goal was avoiding any possible controversy. The couch was beige, the dining table was wood-colored laminate, and the bedroom set looked like it had come from a hotel that specialized in hosting business travelers who needed a place to sleep but had no interest in feeling at home. For the first time in years, James loved where he lived. He established routines that belonged entirely to him: coffee at 6:30 while reading the news on his tablet instead of making conversation about Margaret's yoga class schedule. Breakfast that consisted of whatever he felt like eating, sometimes leftover pizza, sometimes a protein shake, sometimes nothing at all because he wasn't hungry yet and there was no one around to worry about his nutritional choices. Evenings spent watching documentaries about construction projects and engineering failures without having to negotiate with someone who wanted to watch cooking shows or romantic comedies that made them both feel uncomfortable for reasons they couldn't articulate. Margaret seemed to be thriving in ways that both surprised and relieved him. Her Instagram posts showed her attending wellness retreats and hiking excursions with a frequency that would have been impossible when she was coordinating her schedule around a husband's needs. She'd started teaching Pilates classes at a local studio and had begun offering private wellness coaching sessions that often ran late into the evening. When they ran into each other at the grocery store 6 weeks after he'd moved out, she looked more vibrant and energetic than he'd seen her in years. They'd talked for 15 minutes in the produce section, catching up on practical matters like forwarding mail and coordinating the final details of their asset division. The conversation was friendly, almost warm, like they were old college friends who'd happened to bump into each other in an unexpected place. Margaret mentioned that she was considering getting a dog, something she'd wanted for years but had never pursued because James was allergic to pet dander. James told her about a new construction project his company had won, a medical complex that would take 2 years to complete and require him to travel frequently to supervise different phases of the work. They parted ways with genuine smiles and wishes for each other's happiness, both of them relieved to discover that they could coexist in the same town without drama or awkwardness. The relief James felt about the lack of animosity in their divorce was overshadowed by a growing concern about what came next. For 14 years, his identity had been built around being Margaret's husband. His social life, his living situation, his daily routines, even his long-term financial planning had all been structured around the assumption that he was half of a permanent partnership. Now, at 42, he was essentially starting over with no roadmap for how to build a life that was entirely his own. Dating felt impossible to imagine, not because he was still emotionally attached to Margaret, but because he couldn't figure out how to explain his situation to potential partners. How do you tell someone that you divorced your wife because you both realized you weren't attracted to each other anymore, even though you still respected each other and had never cheated or fought or experienced any of the dramatic relationship failures that people understood? How do you describe the slow, quiet death of a marriage that had simply run out of reasons to continue existing? James started going to therapy, not because he was devastated by his divorce, but because he was worried that he should be more devastated than he actually was. Dr. Richardson, a psychiatrist who specialized in life transitions, listened to his concerns with the neutral expression of someone who'd heard variations of this story many times before. When James asked if it was normal to feel so calm about the end of a 14-year marriage, Dr. Richardson asked him what he thought normal was supposed to feel like. The therapy sessions became a place where James could examine the assumptions he'd been carrying about marriage, commitment, and what constituted a successful relationship. He'd grown up believing that good marriages required hard work, compromise, and dedication, that couples who truly loved each other could weather any storm and emerge stronger on the other side. But nobody had ever explained what you were supposed to do when the problem wasn't a storm you could weather together, but the gradual realization that you were two people who had simply outgrown the life you'd built together. Dr. Richardson introduced him to the concept that relationships could end not because of failure, but because of completion. Some partnerships, she explained, were meant to serve specific purposes during particular phases of people's lives, and recognizing when those purposes had been fulfilled wasn't a sign of inadequacy, but of maturity. James and Margaret had helped each other transition from young adults figuring out their careers to established professionals with clear identities and goals. They'd supported each other through the deaths of grandparents, job changes, health scares, and the ordinary stresses of building adult lives from scratch. The fact that they no longer needed the same things from a relationship didn't diminish the value of what they'd shared. It just meant they were ready for different chapters. This perspective helped James understand why he felt so peaceful about his divorce, but it didn't solve the practical problem of figuring out what his next chapter was supposed to look like. For the first time since college, his future was completely unscripted. He could move to a different city, change careers, travel extensively, or stay exactly where he was and build a bachelor lifestyle around his work and his hobbies. The freedom was both exhilarating and terrifying. James began experimenting with different versions of himself. He joined a recreational soccer league for men over 40, something he'd wanted to do for years but had avoided because Margaret found sports boring and he'd felt guilty about spending weekend time on activities that didn't include her. He discovered that he was still a decent midfielder, despite not having played competitively since high school, and the physical exhaustion of running around a field for 90 minutes was exactly the kind of stress relief he hadn't realized he needed. He also started cooking for himself, not just heating up frozen meals or ordering takeout, but actually planning menus and shopping for ingredients and learning techniques from YouTube videos. During his marriage, meal planning had been a source of constant negotiation. Margaret's wellness coaching philosophy meant she avoided gluten, dairy, processed sugar, and anything that wasn't organic and locally sourced when possible. James had spent years eating quinoa salads and steamed vegetables with grilled chicken, not because he disliked healthy food, but because every meal had to be approved by someone whose relationship with nutrition was more complex than his own. Now he could make pasta with store-brand marinara sauce if he wanted to, or eat nothing but cereal for dinner, or spend Saturday afternoon making elaborate curries from scratch just because the process of cooking something complicated sounded appealing. The social aspects of his new life were more challenging to navigate. Most of his married friends seemed to view his divorce as either a cautionary tale or an enviable escape, depending on their own relationship satisfaction levels. Tom Jenkins started making jokes about James being back on the market and offered to set him up with single women from his office. Sarah Jenkins, meanwhile, seemed to take his divorce as a personal affront to the institution of marriage and kept asking if he'd tried couples counseling or if there wasn't some way he and Margaret could work things out. James found himself gravitating toward friendships with other divorced men, not because they shared war stories about terrible ex-wives, but because they understood the strange combination of grief and relief that came with ending a marriage that had simply stopped working. Mike Henderson, a guy from his soccer league who'd divorced 2 years earlier, became his guide to the practical aspects of single life after 40. Which banks offered the best rates for individual checking accounts, where to buy decent furniture without spending a fortune, how to maintain friendships with married couples who didn't know how to include a single person in their social activities. The loneliness James experienced wasn't the devastating heartbreak he'd expected, but something more subtle and complex. He missed having someone to share daily observations with, the interesting article he'd read during lunch, the funny conversation he'd overheard at the coffee shop, the frustrating interaction with a difficult client. He missed having a witness to his life, someone who understood the context of his experiences and could appreciate why certain things were significant or amusing. But he didn't miss Margaret specifically. He missed the concept of partnership. The idea of being known well enough by another person that half sentences could communicate entire thoughts. 6 months into his new life, James realized that he was happier than he'd been in years, but he was also lonelier than he'd ever been in his adult life. The contradiction didn't bother him as much as it might have bothered someone who viewed happiness and loneliness as mutually exclusive conditions. He was learning that human emotions were more complicated than the simple binary choices he'd been trained to expect, that you could simultaneously miss being married and be grateful for your divorce, that you could love someone deeply and also recognize that living with them was slowly killing parts of yourself you hadn't realized were dying. Margaret seemed to be navigating her own version of the same experience. When they'd met for coffee to finalize some insurance paperwork, she'd talked about feeling more like herself than she had since her 20s, but also admitted that she sometimes felt overwhelmed by the number of choices available to her now that she didn't have to consider someone else's preferences for every decision. She'd started dating someone, a yoga instructor named Marcus, who shared her interest in meditation retreats and organic farming, but she described their relationship in tentative terms, like she was still learning how to be attracted to someone new after so many years of feeling nothing. Their coffee meeting had been surprisingly comfortable. They'd laughed about some of their old routines, particularly their elaborate system for dividing household chores that had somehow made both of them feel like they were doing more than their fair share. Margaret had brought photos from a hiking trip she'd taken to Colorado, and James had shown her pictures of the medical complex construction project he was supervising. They talked like friends who had shared significant life experiences but were now moving in different directions, with warmth but without any desire to return to the intimacy they'd once shared. James realized, sitting across from his ex-wife in a coffee shop where they'd never gone together during their marriage, that their divorce had been the most successful thing they'd accomplished as a team in years. They'd recognized a problem that couldn't be solved, addressed it honestly and directly, and separated their lives with minimal damage to either party. They'd managed to end their marriage while preserving their respect for each other and their gratitude for the years when they'd been genuinely happy together. In a culture that viewed divorce as failure, they'd somehow managed to make it feel like a mature acknowledgement of changed circumstances, rather than a devastating breakdown of commitment. But understanding that his divorce was a success didn't eliminate the fundamental challenge of rebuilding his life from scratch. James had spent his adult years becoming an expert at being a husband, and now he needed to learn how to be a single man in his 40s who might or might not want to become a husband again someday, to someone who might or might not exist. The learning curve was steeper than he'd anticipated, and some days he felt like an exchange student trying to navigate a culture whose customs he didn't fully understand. The worst moments came late at night, when he'd finished his dinner and cleaned his apartment and completed all the tasks that filled his evenings, and suddenly found himself with nothing to do and no one to do it with. The silence in his apartment wasn't the comfortable silence of solitude. It was the hollow silence of isolation. During his marriage, even when he and Margaret weren't talking, there had been the background presence of another person moving through the house, running water in the bathroom, turning pages of a magazine, breathing in the bed next to him. Now the silence was complete, and sometimes it felt like being the last person left in the world after some catastrophe had disappeared everyone else without warning. James started leaving the television on for background noise, not because he was watching anything in particular, but because the sound of voices made his apartment feel less like a museum of his own life. He bought a houseplant, then 2 more, not because he developed an interest in gardening, but because taking care of something living gave him a sense of purpose during the hours when work ended and bedtime was still several hours away. He began taking longer walks around his neighborhood, sometimes covering 5 or 6 miles, just to have a reason to be moving through the world instead of sitting alone in rooms that felt too quiet and too small. The dating question haunted him in ways he hadn't expected, not because he was desperate for companionship, but because he couldn't figure out what he wanted from a relationship or what he had to offer someone else. His marriage to Margaret had been his only serious adult relationship, and it had started when they were both young enough to grow into their partnership together. Now he was a fully formed 42-year-old man with established preferences, routines, and habits that had been shaped by years of living with someone whose needs were completely different from his own. How do you merge a life that's already complete with someone else's equally complete life? How do you create intimacy with someone when you're still figuring out who you are when no one else is watching? James tried online dating for exactly 3 weeks before deleting his profile. The process of describing himself in a few paragraphs felt impossible. How do you summarize a person's entire personality in the space typically reserved for describing a used car? The women he matched with seemed to fall into 2 categories: those who were recently divorced and clearly looking for someone to help them process their anger about their ex-husbands, and those who had been single for years and had developed such specific requirements for potential partners that he felt like he was applying for a job he wasn't qualified for. The 3 dates he went on were exercises in mutual politeness that left everyone involved feeling like they'd wasted an evening. The conversations were fine, the restaurants were fine, the women were fine, but everything felt scripted and artificial in ways that made James miss the easy familiarity he'd once shared with Margaret, even during the years when that familiarity had become more of a trap than a comfort. He realized that he wasn't ready to be vulnerable with someone new, partly because he was still figuring out what his own vulnerabilities were now that he wasn't defining himself in relation to another person's needs and expectations. Work became his refuge and his identity in ways it had never been during his marriage. James started volunteering for the most challenging projects, the ones that required him to travel frequently and solve complex logistical problems under tight deadlines. He discovered that he had a talent for managing construction teams in difficult environments, and his reputation within the industry began growing beyond his own company. Competitors started trying to recruit him. Trade publications began featuring his projects in articles about innovative construction techniques. For the first time in his career, James felt like he was building something meaningful rather than just earning a paycheck. The success at work provided a sense of accomplishment and purpose that helped offset the loneliness of his personal life, but it also created new challenges. The more successful he became professionally, the more he was expected to attend industry events, client dinners, and networking functions where everyone else seemed to arrive with spouses or long-term partners. Being the only single person at a table of couples made him feel like an incomplete equation, and he began declining invitations to events that weren't strictly necessary for his work. Margaret, meanwhile, was posting increasingly adventurous photos on social media, rock climbing trips with her new boyfriend, yoga retreats in Costa Rica, weekend camping excursions with groups of friends who all seemed to share her enthusiasm for outdoor activities and organic food and spiritual growth practices. She looked genuinely happy in ways that James could barely remember her looking during their marriage, and he felt simultaneously proud of her transformation and envious of how easily she seemed to be building a new life that aligned with her actual interests and values.
Their paths crossed occasionally in the grocery store or at the gas station, and these encounters were always friendly but brief. They'd exchange updates about work and family members, ask polite questions about each other's lives, and part ways with genuine wishes for continued happiness. But James began noticing that these meetings left him feeling melancholy for reasons he couldn't identify. Not because he missed Margaret or regretted their divorce, but because seeing her reminded him of the person he'd been when he was part of a couple, and he wasn't sure if that person had been better or worse than the person he was becoming as a single man. The first anniversary of their separation passed without acknowledgement from either of them, but James was acutely aware of the date. A year earlier, he'd been living in a house he'd helped choose, sleeping next to a woman he'd promised to love forever, planning weekend activities around someone else's preferences and schedule. Now he was living in a rented apartment, spending weekends on construction sites or hiking trails, answering only to himself for how he spent his time and money. The transformation was so complete that it sometimes felt like he was remembering someone else's life rather than his own. But the strangest part wasn't how much had changed, it was how natural the changes felt. James had expected his divorce to feel like a catastrophic disruption of his identity, like losing a limb or surviving a natural disaster that left him permanently altered and diminished. Instead, it felt like waking up from a long dream that had been pleasant enough while it lasted, but bore no resemblance to the life he actually wanted to be living. He was lonelier now, but he was also more himself than he'd been in years, and most days that felt like a fair trade. 2 years into his new life, James discovered something unexpected about himself. He was becoming someone he actually liked. The realization hit him on a Tuesday evening while he was grilling salmon on the small balcony of his apartment, listening to a podcast about sustainable architecture and watching the sunset over downtown Millfield. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about what he should be doing instead, or feeling guilty about spending time alone. He was simply present in his own life, enjoying his own company, and that felt like a minor miracle. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been a slow accumulation of small choices and gradual adjustments, like a building that takes shape one careful measurement at a time. James had learned to fill his evenings with activities that genuinely interested him rather than obligations he felt he should fulfill. He'd started taking photography classes at the community college, not because he harbored any illusions about becoming a professional photographer, but because the technical aspects of capturing light and composition appealed to the same part of his brain that enjoyed solving construction challenges. His apartment walls were now decorated with black and white photographs of industrial landscapes and architectural details that he'd taken during his travels for work. The soccer league had evolved into something more significant than just recreational exercise. James had become one of the team's unofficial leaders, the guy who organized post-game dinners and helped coordinate carpools to away games. The physical activity was still important, but the social connections had become equally valuable. These were men in their 40s and 50s who understood the challenges of maintaining friendships while juggling careers, family obligations, and the gradual realization that their bodies couldn't do everything they'd been able to do at 25. They talked about work stress and aging parents and the strange experience of watching their contemporaries get divorced, remarry, have midlife crises, or sometimes just disappear into suburban domesticity so completely that they seem to vanish from social circulation entirely. Through soccer, James met David Chen, a divorced architect who'd been single for 5 years and had reached a level of contentment with his independence that James found inspiring. David had built a life that revolved around his work designing sustainable housing, his hobby of restoring vintage motorcycles, and a rotating cast of casual relationships with women who appreciated his company but had no interest in merging their lives with his. He'd mastered the art of being alone without being lonely, and he'd developed a philosophy about relationships that challenged everything James had been taught about marriage and commitment. David's approach to dating was refreshingly honest and straightforward. He was clear from the beginning about his availability and his limitations. He enjoyed the company of intelligent, independent women, but he had no desire to cohabitate, merge finances, or make the kinds of long-term commitments that traditional relationships required. Surprisingly, this directness attracted rather than repelled potential partners. Women in their 40s and 50s who had already been married, raised children, and established their own identities often found his approach liberating rather than disappointing. They could enjoy his company without feeling pressure to evaluate him as potential husband material or worry about whether their relationship was going somewhere in the conventional sense. Watching David navigate this alternative approach to romantic relationships expanded James's understanding of what was possible. Marriage and long-term commitment weren't the only valid ways to experience intimacy and connection. There were other models: friends with benefits, casual but exclusive relationships, companionship without cohabitation, that might actually be more suitable for people who had already lived through the experience of trying to build their entire identity around a romantic partnership. James wasn't ready to start dating again, but he was beginning to understand what he might want when he eventually did feel ready. The idea of marriage held no appeal for him anymore, not because his divorce had been traumatic, but because he discovered that he genuinely preferred living alone. He liked being able to travel for work without coordinating with anyone else's schedule. He liked being able to spend entire weekends reading or working on photography projects without feeling obligated to entertain a partner or make conversation. He liked having complete control over his living space, his finances, and his daily routines. But he also missed physical intimacy and intellectual companionship, and he was beginning to think there might be ways to have those things without sacrificing the independence he'd grown to value. The work opportunities that had emerged as a result of his increased focus and availability were reshaping his entire career trajectory. James had always been competent at his job, but being freed from the constraints of coordinating his schedule around a spouse's needs had allowed him to take on projects that required extensive travel and unconventional time commitments. He'd spent 3 months in Phoenix overseeing the construction of a solar energy facility, 6 weeks in Seattle managing the renovation of a historic office building, and 2 months in Denver coordinating the installation of sustainable building systems in a new university campus. These assignments had given him expertise in emerging construction technologies and sustainable building practices that were becoming increasingly important in the industry. Climate-conscious construction was no longer a niche specialty. It was becoming the standard, and James found himself positioned at the forefront of a rapidly evolving field. Companies were competing to hire him not just as a project manager, but as a consultant who could help them transition their practices to meet new environmental standards and energy efficiency requirements. The financial benefits of his career advancement were substantial, but the personal satisfaction was even more significant. For the first time since college, James felt like he was working in a field that aligned with his values and contributed to something larger than just commercial profit. The buildings he was helping create would use less energy, produce fewer emissions, and provide healthier working environments for their occupants. His work had meaning beyond just earning a paycheck, and that sense of purpose filled parts of his life that had been empty since his divorce. The success also brought unexpected social opportunities. Industry conferences and professional associations put him in contact with other people who shared his interests and values, and many of these connections developed into genuine friendships. James discovered that he was more socially confident and articulate when he was talking about subjects he was passionate about, and his reputation as an expert in sustainable construction made him a sought-after dinner companion at professional events. For the first time in his adult life, he was building a social circle based on his own interests and achievements rather than on his status as half of a married couple. Margaret's life had taken an equally dramatic but completely different trajectory. Her wellness coaching practice had expanded into a full-time business with a waiting list of clients and enough income to support the kind of lifestyle she'd always dreamed about. She'd moved out of their old house and into a smaller place closer to downtown that had been converted into a live workspace where she could see clients and teach group classes. Her social media presence showed a woman who was thriving in ways that would have been impossible during their marriage. Leading meditation retreats, organizing hiking expeditions, traveling to wellness conferences in places like Sedona and Costa Rica. Her relationship with Marcus had evolved into something that looked like a partnership but operated with much more flexibility than traditional marriage.
They maintained separate apartments, split their time between solo activities and shared adventures, and seemed to have built their relationship around mutual support for each other's individual growth rather than trying to merge their lives into a single shared existence. Margaret posted photos of them together at yoga retreats and farmers markets, but also posted equally enthusiastic photos of solo camping trips and girls' weekends that showed her maintaining her independence even within the context of a committed relationship. When James ran into them together at a coffee shop near the university, he was struck by how comfortable and natural they seemed together. There was an ease in their interaction that he and Margaret had never achieved, even during their happiest years. They touched each other casually and frequently, finished each other's sentences without seeming to have lost their individual voices, and included James in their conversation without any of the awkwardness he'd expected from such an encounter. Margaret looked genuinely happy to see him and seemed proud to introduce Marcus, who turned out to be an intelligent and genuinely friendly guy who shared James's interest in sustainable building practices. The conversation lasted almost an hour, and by the end of it, James felt like he'd gained insight into what successful relationships could look like when they were built around compatibility and genuine affection rather than social expectations and financial convenience. Margaret and Marcus clearly enjoyed each other's company and supported each other's goals, but they also maintained separate identities and interests that didn't require constant negotiation or compromise. They seemed to have figured out how to be together without losing themselves, which was something James and Margaret had never managed to achieve. Walking home from that encounter, James felt a complex mixture of emotions that took him several days to sort through. He was genuinely happy for Margaret and relieved to see that her post-divorce life was fulfilling in ways their marriage had never been. But he was also envious of how easily she seemed to transition from one relationship to another, and he wondered if there was something wrong with him that he still felt no desire to open himself up to that kind of vulnerability again. Dr. Richardson helped him understand that there was no timeline or formula for post-divorce emotional recovery. Some people rebound quickly into new relationships because they needed the structure and identity that came with being part of a couple. Others took years to rediscover who they were outside the context of marriage and might never choose to remarry or cohabitate again. Neither approach was healthier or more mature than the other. They were just different ways of processing the end of a significant life chapter and moving forward into whatever came next. James was beginning to understand that his reluctance to date wasn't necessarily a sign of emotional damage or fear of intimacy. It might simply be a reflection of the fact that he was genuinely happier living alone than he had been living with someone whose needs and preferences were constantly at odds with his own. The loneliness he sometimes experienced was real and significant, but it was manageable in ways that the slow suffocation of his marriage had not been. He was learning to distinguish between being alone and being lonely, and discovering that they weren't the same thing. The third anniversary of his divorce passed with James feeling more settled and confident than he had since his early 20s. His apartment had evolved from a temporary landing place into a home that reflected his actual personality and interests. The generic furniture had been replaced with pieces he'd chosen carefully: a leather reading chair where he spent Sunday mornings with coffee and the newspaper, bookshelves filled with architecture and photography books he actually read, a kitchen equipped with the tools and appliances he needed for the kind of cooking he enjoyed doing. He'd established routines and relationships that provided structure and meaning without requiring him to compromise his preferences or coordinate his schedule with anyone else's needs. Tuesday evenings were reserved for photography class. Thursday nights were soccer practice. Weekend mornings were for long runs through the downtown area, followed by breakfast at a diner where he'd become a regular customer. Saturday afternoons were often spent at construction sites, either working on consulting projects or just visiting to observe innovative building techniques and sustainable technologies that were being implemented by other companies. The predictability of these routines might have felt limiting during his marriage, when every weekend required negotiation and compromise and consideration of Margaret's equally valid but completely different preferences.
Now the predictability felt like freedom. He could plan his weeks around activities he genuinely wanted to do, and he could change those plans at the last minute if something more interesting came up, without having to explain himself to anyone or worry about disappointing a partner whose needs weren't being met. James had also developed a deeper appreciation for solitude that went beyond just enjoying his independence. He'd learned to use time alone for reflection and creative projects in ways he'd never been able to do when his attention was constantly divided between his own interests and the requirements of maintaining a relationship. His photography had evolved from a casual hobby into a serious artistic pursuit. His apartment was filled with equipment, cameras, lenses, developing supplies, printing materials that would have been impossible to maintain in a shared living space where every purchase and every use of available space required discussion and negotiation. The photographs he was taking had started attracting attention beyond just his personal satisfaction. A local gallery had included 3 of his architectural photographs in a group show featuring amateur artists, and 2 of them had sold to collectors who appreciated his unique perspective on industrial landscapes and sustainable building design. The validation was gratifying, but more importantly, the creative work was providing a form of self-expression that he'd never had access to during his marriage. One evening, while organizing his photography files on his computer, James came across a folder of pictures from his marriage that he'd forgotten existed. Photos from vacations, dinner parties, holidays, anniversaries, documentation of 14 years of shared experiences that had once felt like the most important parts of his life.
Looking at them now was like examining artifacts from an archaeological dig. He could remember the events and recognize the people, but the emotions attached to those memories felt distant and muted, like they belonged to someone else. In some of the photos, he and Margaret looked genuinely happy together. Beach vacations where they were tan and relaxed, dinner parties where they were laughing at something one of their friends had said, quiet moments at home where they seemed comfortable and content in each other's presence. But even in the happiest pictures, James could now see signs of the disconnect that had eventually destroyed their marriage. They were rarely looking at each other. Their body language was polite rather than intimate. Their smiles looked performative rather than spontaneous. The most telling photos were the ones from their later years together, particularly from social events where they were surrounded by other couples. In those pictures, James and Margaret looked like actors playing the roles of a married couple rather than 2 people who were genuinely excited to be sharing their lives with each other. They stood next to each other because that's where spouses were supposed to stand, but there was no magnetic pull between them, no sense that they were choosing to be close because they couldn't imagine being anywhere else. James spent an hour looking through those photos, not with sadness or regret, but with the analytical detachment of someone studying a case history. The visual evidence confirmed what he'd already understood intellectually. His marriage hadn't failed because of any dramatic betrayal or incompatibility. It had simply run its course, like a subscription that had expired or a lease that had reached its natural termination date. He and Margaret had been good for each other during the years when they both needed to learn how to be adults in committed relationships. But they had outgrown what they could offer each other, and continuing to try to force compatibility would have been unfair to both of them. He deleted most of the photos, but saved a few that captured genuinely happy moments. Not because he wanted to preserve romantic memories, but because those experiences had been real and significant parts of his life story, even if they belonged to a chapter that was now closed. Margaret had been an important person in his life for 14 years, and pretending that those years hadn't happened or hadn't mattered would have been dishonest and unnecessarily harsh. The 4th year after his divorce brought changes that James hadn't anticipated. His consulting work had become so successful that he was able to leave his staff position and start his own company specializing in sustainable construction project management. The transition was financially risky but professionally exhilarating. For the first time in his career, he was working entirely on projects that aligned with his values and interests. And he could choose his clients based on the quality and environmental impact of their proposed buildings rather than just accepting whatever assignments were available. The independence of running his own business suited his personality in ways that working for someone else never had.
He could set his own schedule, choose his own projects, and travel as extensively as his work required, without having to request permission or coordinate with supervisors who might not understand the technical demands of sustainable construction. The financial success was gratifying, but the intellectual challenges and creative problem-solving aspects of the work were even more satisfying. James hired 2 junior project managers to help with the increasing workload and discovered that he enjoyed mentoring younger professionals who were passionate about environmental building practices. Teaching others helped him articulate his own expertise and philosophy about construction in ways that deepened his understanding of his field. He started speaking at industry conferences and writing articles for trade publications, establishing himself as a thought leader in sustainable building practices rather than just a competent project manager. The professional success brought social opportunities that were different from anything he'd experienced during his marriage. He was invited to dinner parties and networking events not as someone's spouse, but as an individual with his own interesting career and expertise. The conversations at these gatherings were substantive and engaging in ways that the social events he'd attended as Margaret's husband had rarely been. He could talk about his work without having to explain or apologize for his enthusiasm, and people were genuinely interested in his opinions and experiences. At one of these professional gatherings, James met Elena Vasquez, a landscape architect who specialized in designing sustainable outdoor spaces for commercial buildings. Their initial conversation was entirely professional. She was working on a project that required coordination with sustainable building systems, and she wanted his advice about integrating water management and energy efficiency considerations into her landscape design. But the conversation extended far beyond the original technical questions, and James found himself genuinely enjoying her company in ways that had nothing to do with business networking. Elena was in her late 30s, divorced for 6 years, and had built her career around the same environmental values that motivated James's work. She lived alone in a converted warehouse space that served as both her home and her design studio. And she seemed to have achieved the same kind of comfortable independence that James had discovered he preferred. Their relationship developed gradually over several months of professional collaboration and personal conversation, without any of the pressure or expectations that James remembered from traditional dating. They worked together on 3 different projects before they had their first non-professional dinner together, and even then, the evening felt more like an extension of their ongoing collaboration than a formal date. Elena understood the demands of running an independent consulting business because she was navigating the same challenges. She appreciated James's dedication to his work because she shared the same level of commitment to her own projects. Most importantly, she had no interest in merging their lives or creating the kind of domestic partnership that would require either of them to compromise their professional independence or personal autonomy. The relationship that developed between James and Elena was unlike anything he had experienced before. They spent time together when their schedules allowed and when they genuinely wanted each other's company. But they maintained separate homes, separate finances, and separate social circles. They supported each other's professional goals and celebrated each other's successes, but they didn't feel obligated to share every experience or coordinate every decision. Elena had her own friends, her own hobbies, and her own way of spending time alone that didn't include James. And he had the same kinds of independent activities and relationships that didn't involve her. The physical relationship between them was intense and satisfying in ways that James's marriage had never been, partly because it was based on genuine desire rather than marital obligation, and partly because they came together as complete individuals who chose to be intimate rather than as 2 people who felt entitled to each other's bodies because of legal and social contracts. Elena was confident about her own needs and articulate about her preferences in ways that made James more aware of his own desires and more comfortable expressing them honestly. But the emotional intimacy was equally important. James found that he could be vulnerable with Elena about his fears, his ambitions, and his uncertainties, without worrying that she would try to fix him or change him or make his problems her responsibility. She listened to his concerns about his business, his occasional loneliness, his complicated feelings about his divorce, without feeling obligated to provide solutions or reassurance. She offered perspective and support when he asked for it, but she also respected his ability to work through his own challenges independently. Elena had her own equivalent level of emotional self-sufficiency. She'd been through her own difficult divorce and period of rebuilding, and she'd learned to find fulfillment and security within herself rather than looking to romantic relationships to provide those things. She enjoyed James's company and appreciated the connection they shared, but she didn't need him to complete her or validate her choices or provide her with a sense of identity or purpose. The relationship lasted 2 years, and it ended as amicably as it had developed. Elena was offered an opportunity to design the landscaping for a major sustainable development project in Portland, and the work would require her to relocate for at least 18 months. James had established roots in Millfield that he wasn't ready to abandon, and Elena had no desire to maintain a long-distance relationship that would require the kind of coordination and compromise that both of them had specifically chosen to avoid. They had dinner together the night before Elena left for Portland, and the conversation was warm and appreciative, rather than sad or bitter. They had enhanced each other's lives for 2 years without trying to control or possess each other, and they were both grateful for the experience, even as they acknowledged that it had reached its natural conclusion. Elena gave James a small framed photograph she'd taken of one of the buildings he'd helped design, and he gave her a vintage compass he'd found at an antique store that seemed appropriate for someone embarking on a new adventure in an unfamiliar place. The end of his relationship with Elena left James feeling more confident about his ability to connect with someone without losing himself in the process. He'd learned that intimacy didn't require the complete merging of lives that traditional marriage seemed to demand. 2 people could care deeply about each other, support each other's goals, and share meaningful experiences together while still maintaining their individual identities and independence. The relationship hadn't failed because it ended, it had succeeded because it had enriched both their lives without requiring either of them to sacrifice their autonomy or compromise their personal values. James was now 47 years old, financially secure, professionally accomplished, and personally content in ways that would have been impossible to imagine during the final years of his marriage. He lived alone by choice rather than by default, and he'd built a life that reflected his actual interests and values rather than trying to accommodate someone else's completely different priorities. The loneliness that had once felt overwhelming had evolved into solitude that he genuinely enjoyed most of the time. He still missed having someone to share daily observations and experiences with, but he'd learned to find that kind of connection through friendships, professional relationships, and occasional romantic partnerships that didn't require permanent commitment or cohabitation. His relationship with Elena had shown him that intimacy was possible without sacrifice, and that insight had changed his entire understanding of what relationships could be. Margaret had remarried Marcus in a small ceremony that James learned about through mutual friends. According to the reports he heard, it was a celebration that reflected their shared values and interests, an outdoor ceremony followed by a reception that featured organic food, live music, and activities like yoga classes and group hikes. Margaret looked radiant in the photos that appeared on social media, but more importantly, she looked like herself in ways she never had during their marriage. She'd found someone whose lifestyle and values complemented her own, and she'd learned how to be in a committed relationship without losing her individual identity. James felt genuinely happy for her success, and he was grateful that their divorce had allowed both of them to find more authentic ways of living. Their marriage hadn't been a mistake, it had been an important learning experience that had taught them both what they actually needed from relationships and what they were willing to sacrifice to maintain them. The fact that those lessons had led them away from each other rather than deeper into their marriage didn't diminish the value of what they'd shared or learned together. On a warm evening in late spring, James sat on his balcony grilling dinner and reviewing architectural plans for a new project, a mixed-use development that would include affordable housing units, commercial spaces, and a community garden, all designed according to the most advanced sustainable building standards. The work was challenging and meaningful, the kind of project that would improve people's lives while minimizing environmental impact. His business was thriving, his personal relationships were satisfying without being demanding, and his daily life was filled with activities and commitments that he'd chosen because they aligned with his values and interests. The silence around him wasn't the oppressive quiet of isolation, it was the comfortable silence of someone who had learned to enjoy his own company. He could hear traffic in the distance, music playing from someone else's apartment, the sound of his neighbors talking on their own balcony. He was alone, but he was connected to the larger community around him in ways that felt organic and unforced. James realized that he'd achieved something he'd never known he wanted, a life that belonged entirely to him. Not a life that was shaped by compromise, obligation, and the constant negotiation required to maintain a partnership with someone whose needs were fundamentally different from his own, but a life that reflected his actual personality, values, and goals. He was 47 years old, and he was finally living like the person he'd always been underneath all the roles and expectations he'd spent decades trying to fulfill. The future stretched ahead of him with possibilities rather than obligations. He might meet someone else like Elena, who could share parts of his life without trying to control or possess all of it. He might remain contentedly single and continue building his business and his friendships and his creative projects. He might decide to travel more extensively, or move to a different city, or take on projects in other countries where sustainable building practices were just beginning to develop. All of these options felt equally appealing because they were all choices he could make based on his own interests and circumstances rather than having to coordinate with someone else's different but equally valid preferences. James finished his dinner as the sun set over downtown Millfield, and he felt something he'd been searching for without knowing it for most of his adult life. Complete satisfaction with the present moment and genuine excitement about whatever came next. He was alone, but he wasn't lonely. He was single, but he wasn't incomplete. He was free to make choices based on his own values and desires, and that freedom felt like the most valuable thing he'd ever possessed. The divorce that had once seemed like the end of his life had actually been the beginning of it. Margaret had been right when she'd said she didn't feel attracted to him anymore, and he'd been right when he'd said the feeling was mutual. But what they'd both discovered was that the absence of attraction hadn't been a problem to be solved. It had been information to be acknowledged. They'd been two people who had outgrown their reasons for being together, and admitting that truth had freed them both to become the people they were actually meant to be. Sometimes the most successful marriages are the ones that end at exactly the right time, before love turns into resentment and before two good people destroy each other trying to force compatibility that no longer exists. James and Margaret had managed to accomplish that rare thing. They'd ended their marriage while they still respected each other, and they'd both gone on to build better lives than they could have created together. That felt like success rather than failure, wisdom rather than defeat. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.